The shot echoed through Willow Creek like a crack of thunder, drawing Eleanor Fairchild away from the bolts of fabric she'd been examining in Russell's general store. She'd only been in town for 2 days, and already the peace she'd sought by moving west seemed shattered by the violent argument unfolding outside. Curious but cautious, she slipped out the back door, creeping along the weathered boards until she could peer around the corner. 3 men stood in the dusty street, one clutching his bleeding arm while the other 2 faced each other, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. The taller man, broad-shouldered and steady-handed, kept his revolver aimed at the ground now, but his stance suggested he was ready to raise it again at any moment. Eleanor couldn't hear all their words, but phrases drifted toward her on the hot summer breeze. "Won't tell you again, Donovan." The McCoy family's claim is legal and binding. Legal? Nothing's legal about stealing a man's water rights. The wounded man spat, his face contorted in pain and fury. Eleanor pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the store, heart racing. She'd come west to escape Chicago's suffocating propriety after her father's financial disgrace and subsequent death, had left her alone and unmarried at 22. Montana Territory in 1879 had seemed like a place where a woman might forge a new path, perhaps as a schoolteacher once the town grew large enough. She hadn't expected to witness a shootout her first week. The tall defender of the McCoys stepped closer to the wounded man. "Get yourself to Doc Wheeler, then get out of town. Your grievance has been heard and dismissed by Judge Wilson. Try anything like this again, and I won't aim for your arm." As the injured man stumbled away, Eleanor tried to retreat, but her boot knocked against an empty tin can. The sound, though small, carried in the sudden silence. The tall man turned sharply, his eyes scanning the side of the building until they found her partially concealed form. "Madam," he called, holstering his weapon with a practiced motion, "you can come out now. Danger's past." Eleanor froze, mortified at being caught eavesdropping. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, and she considered fleeing back inside but knew it was too late. When he rounded the corner, she found herself looking up into the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a well-worn Stetson. "Come out proud," he said, his voice gentler now. "No need to hide, I'm Brock Ramsey, town marshal." Eleanor stepped forward, straightening her spine and gathering her dignity. "Eleanor Fairchild, I arrived on Tuesday's stage. I didn't mean to intrude." The marshal's weathered face softened into a smile that transformed his severe features. "No intrusion, Miss Fairchild. Though listening in on business that might get you shot isn't the wisest introduction to Willow Creek." Her cheeks flushed. "I was concerned someone might be hurt. Where I come from, disagreements rarely involve firearms. And where might that be?" He asked, studying her with undisguised curiosity. "Chicago until recently." She brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I've come west to start anew." Marshal Ramsey nodded, as if this explanation satisfied something for him. "Well, Miss Fairchild, welcome to Willow Creek. We're usually more hospitable than what you witnessed today." He tipped his hat. "If you need anything while you're settling in, my office is across from the hotel." Eleanor watched him walk away, his tall frame cutting a commanding figure against the setting sun. She hadn't come west looking for a man quite the opposite, but there was something about Brock Ramsey that intrigued her beyond his obvious good looks. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. After years of her father's vacillations and compromises, such certainty seemed almost exotic. The following morning, Eleanor rose early in her small rented room above the milliner's shop. She dressed in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist, determined to begin inquiries about employment. The town was still small, but growing rapidly as the railroad construction approached. Surely someone would need a woman who could read, write, calculate, and even speak passable French. Mrs. Holloway at the hotel dining room greeted her warmly. "Morning, Miss Fairchild. Sleep well." Yes, thank you. Eleanor settled at a small table by the window. Mrs. Holloway, I was hoping you might direct me toward potential employment opportunities in town. I'm qualified as a teacher, but I'm versatile. The older woman set down a cup of coffee. Well now, teaching position won't be available until the town council votes on building a proper schoolhouse come autumn. Most children are taught at home or sent east for schooling. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. Though I did hear Mrs. Russell at the general store mention needing help with her books. Her eyesight's failing, poor dear. Eleanor brightened. I'm quite good with accounts, I'll speak with her today. After breakfast, she walked through town, noting how the morning light transformed Willow Creek from the ominous setting of yesterday's confrontation to a bustling, hopeful community. New buildings were going up alongside the weathered original structures. Men tipped their hats as she passed, some perhaps too interested in the new single woman in town, but none were improper. At the general store, Mrs. Russell greeted her warmly. The woman was perhaps 60, with silver hair and spectacles that she constantly adjusted as if they never quite suited. When Eleanor inquired about assistance with the accounts, Mrs. Russell's face brightened considerably. Oh my, what a blessing you'd be. My eyes aren't what they were, and Benjamin, that's Mr. Russell, has never had the patience for figures. We've been getting by, but with the town growing so rapidly, our business has nearly doubled this year. They discussed terms, and by noon, Eleanor had secured her first position in Willow Creek to begin the following day. Pleased with her success, she decided to celebrate by purchasing a small pie from the bakery for her dinner. As she exited the bakery, the pie wrapped carefully in paper, she nearly collided with Marshal Ramsey. Miss Fairchild, he said, steadying her with a brief touch to her elbow. Finding everything you need in town, Eleanor nodded, inexplicably flustered by his proximity. Yes, thank you. In fact, I've secured employment with Mrs. Russell, helping with the store's accounts. Congratulations, he said, and his smile seemed genuine. Agnes Russell is good people. The whole family is. I'm grateful for the opportunity. She shifted the package in her hands. And how is the man from yesterday, the one who was shot? The marshal's expression darkened slightly. Patched up and headed back to his claim. The water rights dispute isn't over, I'm afraid, just postponed. He gestured toward the street. May I walk with you? They strolled together, and Eleanor found Marshal Ramsey surprisingly easy to talk to. He explained some of the territory's history, the tensions between longtime settlers and newcomers, and the changes the railroad would bring. The McCoys have been here since '62, he said, built up their ranch from nothing. Donovan arrived last year and tried to divert the creek that runs through both properties. Claims his deed gives him exclusive rights, but Judge Wilson ruled otherwise. Eleanor listened, fascinated by this world so different from the drawing rooms and offices of Chicago. It seems the law is somewhat flexible out here. Not flexible, Brock corrected. Just simpler in some ways, more complex in others. Back east, you might have 3 lawyers arguing over a single paragraph for weeks. Here, sometimes justice needs to be more immediate. And you're the one who delivers it, she observed. He shrugged, but she could see the responsibility weighed on him. I try to keep the peace. Sometimes that means drawing my gun, but more often it means knowing when not to. They reached the milliner's shop where she lodged, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to end their conversation. Thank you for the escort, Marshal. Brock, he said. When I'm not breaking up gunfights, folks just call me Brock. Eleanor, she replied, and the simple exchange of first names felt surprisingly intimate. In the days that followed, Eleanor settled into her new routine. Mornings were spent at the general store, reconciling accounts and organizing orders. Mrs. Russell was delighted with her work and introduced her to the steady stream of customers, helping Eleanor build connections in her new community. She saw Brock nearly every day, sometimes just in passing as he made his rounds, other times in longer conversations when they'd meet at the cafe or on her walks. Each encounter left her more intrigued by the man behind the badge. He was educated, she discovered, having studied law for 2 years in St. Louis before heading west. He quoted Shakespeare occasionally and could discuss politics with surprising nuance for a frontier lawman. 2 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor was working late at the store, finishing the monthly order for supplies from Denver. The Russells had already retired to their home behind the store, leaving her to lock up. As she was about to extinguish the lamps, she heard voices outside, angry, hushed voices that made her pause. Moving cautiously to the window, she peered out to see 3 men huddled in conversation near the alley. One she recognized as Donovan, his arm still in a sling. The others were strangers, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who made their living outside the law. "Ramsey makes his rounds at midnight," Donovan was saying. "We wait till he's checking the saloon, then hit the bank. The safe combination hasn't changed in 2 years." Eleanor's breath caught. They were planning a robbery, and possibly to harm Brock if he interfered. She needed to warn him, but the men were positioned such that they would see her if she left through either the front or back door. Heart pounding, she extinguished the lamps and moved to the storage room at the rear of the store. There was a small window there that opened into the alley behind the building. If she could slip out unnoticed, she might reach the marshal's office before they realized they'd been overheard. The window was small and stiff from disuse, but Eleanor managed to push it open with only a faint creak. She hiked up her skirts and maneuvered through the narrow opening, dropping to the ground with less grace than she would have preferred. Pressing herself against the building's weathered boards, she listened. The men were still talking, their voices now moving toward the saloon. She would have to circle around to reach the marshal's office without being seen. Eleanor crept along the back of the buildings, grateful for the darkness that concealed her. She had nearly reached the end of the alley when a twig snapped underfoot. The sound, though small, seemed to echo in the quiet night. What was that? One of the men's voices carried clearly. "Probably just a cat. This town's overrun with them. Check anyway. Can't be too careful." Footsteps approached her hiding spot. Eleanor pressed herself into the narrow gap between the general store and the adjacent building, praying the shadows would conceal her. A large figure passed by, so close she could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. He paused, seeming to sense her presence, and Eleanor held her breath. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on, returning to his companions. "Nothing there. Let's get a drink while we wait." She waited until their footsteps faded before continuing her careful journey. When she finally reached the marshal's office, she found it empty. Brock must already be making his rounds. The bank was on the opposite end of the main street. If she hurried, she might find him before Donovan and his accomplices put their plan in motion. Eleanor gathered her skirts and ran, no longer concerned about being seen. Warning Brock was all that mattered. She spotted him emerging from the barber shop, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight from within. "Brock," she called, forgetting propriety in her urgency. He turned, surprise evident on his face as she rushed toward him. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Breathlessly, she explained what she'd overheard. His expression darkened as he listened, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on his holstered revolver. "How many men did you see with Donovan?" "2 others," she said. "Rough-looking men I haven't seen in town before." Brock nodded grimly. "Likely the Fletcher brothers. They've been operating throughout the territory." He glanced toward the saloon, where lamplight spilled onto the boardwalk. "Eleanor, I need you to go to Judge Wilson's house, the big white one at the end of Maple Street. Tell him what's happening and that I need his help." "What are you going to do?" she asked, suddenly afraid for him. "My job," he said simply. His eyes softened as he looked at her. "Thank you for warning me. That was brave but foolish. Those men wouldn't hesitate to hurt you if they knew what you'd heard." Before she could respond, he gently turned her in the direction of the judge's house. "Go now, quickly and quietly." Eleanor hurried away, glancing back to see Brock moving purposefully toward the bank, his hand still resting on his gun. She found Judge Wilson at home and delivered her message. The older man immediately sent his son to rouse several trusted townsmen while he himself grabbed a shotgun from above his fireplace. "You stay here, Miss Fairchild," he instructed. "Martha will keep you company." But Eleanor couldn't simply wait, not knowing Brock might be facing 3 armed men alone. As soon as the judge departed, she slipped out, ignoring Mrs. Wilson's protests. She didn't plan to intervene, she wasn't that foolish, but she needed to know what was happening. When she reached Main Street, she saw several men converging on the bank from different directions. Brock stood in the center of the street, his revolver drawn but pointed downward. Donovan and his companions had emerged from the saloon and now stood frozen, clearly surprised to find their plan discovered. "Evening, gentlemen," Brock called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Bit late for banking business, isn't it?" Donovan's face twisted with anger. "You're always interfering, Ramsey, always taking their side." "No sides here, Donovan, just the law, and the law says robbing banks is frowned upon in civilized society." Brock's tone was conversational, but Eleanor could see the tension in his stance. "Now, you and the Fletcher boys can drop those weapons and come along quietly, or this can get messy." For a moment, Eleanor thought Donovan might surrender. Then the man on his left made a sudden move, his hand darting for his holster. What followed happened so quickly Eleanor could barely process it. Gunshots exploded in the quiet night. One of Donovan's companions fell immediately. Donovan himself fired wildly, missing Brock but shattering the window of the hardware store. The third man managed to get off 2 shots before Judge Wilson's shotgun blast knocked him backward into the dirt. When the smoke cleared, Donovan was clutching his shoulder, a fresh wound bleeding through his shirt. His companions lay motionless in the street. Brock stood unharmed, his revolver still raised while the townsmen closed in from all sides. "Drop it, Donovan," Brock commanded. "Don't make me kill you." With a curse, Donovan let his gun fall to the dirt. Eleanor sagged against the nearest building, relief washing through her. Only then did she realize she'd been holding her breath. As the townsmen moved to secure Donovan and check on his fallen companions, Brock scanned the gathering crowd. When he spotted her, his expression shifted from professional detachment to concern tinged with something warmer. He strode toward her, holstering his weapon. "I thought I told you to stay at the judge's house." "I couldn't," she admitted. "I had to know you were safe." Something in his eyes softened. "I've been handling men like Donovan for years." "Nevertheless," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I was concerned." A small smile touched his lips. "Well, I appreciate the concern, though next time I'd prefer you show it from a safe distance." Judge Wilson approached, interrupting their moment. "Marshal, the Fletcher boys are dead. Donovan's wounded, but he'll live to stand trial." "Good," Brock nodded. "We'll need to send telegrams to the territorial marshal and the other towns where they're wanted." He turned back to Eleanor. "Let me escort you home. It's been quite an evening." As they walked through the now bustling street, townspeople emerging from homes and businesses to witness the aftermath, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. This wasn't the quiet new beginning she'd imagined when heading west, but she couldn't deny the rush of feelings that came with being part of something that mattered. "You know," Brock said as they reached her lodgings, "most new arrivals try to avoid excitement, not dive headfirst into it." Eleanor smiled up at him. "I'm discovering I'm not like most new arrivals." "No," he agreed, his eyes warm in the moonlight. "You certainly are not." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Eleanor. Try not to uncover any more criminal conspiracies before morning." She watched him walk away, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. This was not part of her plan. Developing feelings for the town marshal wasn't the fresh start she'd envisioned. Yet as she climbed the stairs to her room, Eleanor admitted to herself that Willow Creek and Brock Ramsey had already worked their way under her skin in ways she hadn't anticipated. The following weeks brought a gradual shift in Eleanor's place within Willow Creek. The incident with Donovan had elevated her from the new woman from back east to someone the townspeople regarded with respect. Mrs. Russell proudly told customers how her clever assistant had foiled a bank robbery, often embellishing the tale until Eleanor hardly recognized her own actions in the retelling. Her relationship with Brock evolved too, moving from casual encounters to deliberate meetings. He began escorting her to Sunday services, and occasionally they shared dinner at the hotel restaurant. Nothing improper, always in public, always respectable, but the town noticed. Eleanor caught the speculative glances from the ladies at church, the knowing smiles when Brock tipped his hat to her on the street. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 3 months after her arrival in Willow Creek, Eleanor was inventorying new shipments when Brock appeared at the store. He looked unusually formal, his usual trail-worn clothes replaced by a clean dark suit, his badge polished to a shine. "Marshal," Mrs. Russell greeted him with a barely concealed smile. "What brings you by our establishment today? Official business, Mrs. Russell," he said, though his eyes found Eleanor immediately. "I need to borrow Miss Fairchild for a while if you can spare her." Mrs. Russell made a show of considering the request. "Well, we are dreadfully busy, but I suppose the town's safety must come first. Go on, Eleanor." Puzzled but intrigued, Eleanor removed her work apron and smoothed her hair. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Brock assured her. "I just need your assistance with something." Outside, he offered his arm, which she took after only a moment's hesitation. "You look very official today," she observed as they walked. "Judge Wilson's swearing in new deputies this afternoon. Thought I should look the part of a respectable lawman." "You always look respectable," she said, then blushed at her own boldness. Brock's smile deepened the creases around his eyes. "That's high praise coming from a city lady like yourself." They turned away from the center of town, following a path that led toward the creek that gave Willow Creek its name. The autumn leaves had begun to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant golds and reds. "Where exactly are we going?" Eleanor finally asked when they'd walked for nearly 20 minutes. "Almost there," Brock promised. "I wanted to show you something." They crested a small hill, and below them lay a cleared stretch of land with a partially constructed building at its center. Men worked on the frame, hammering and measuring, while stacks of lumber waited nearby. "The schoolhouse," Brock explained. "Town council approved it last week. It should be finished before the first snow." Eleanor turned to him, surprised. "I hadn't heard. That's wonderful news." "There's more." He guided her down the path toward the construction. "The council also voted to hire a teacher. Salary's not magnificent, but it includes the little cabin behind the schoolhouse for living quarters." Her heart quickened. "They're hiring a teacher." "They're hiring you," Brock corrected, watching her reaction carefully. "If you want the position." "Judge Wilson was mighty impressed by your conduct during the Donovan affair. Said anyone with that much composure under fire could certainly handle a classroom of frontier children." Eleanor could hardly contain her joy. This was exactly what she'd hoped for when coming west, a chance to build something meaningful, to contribute to a growing community. "I'd be honored, truly honored." Brock's expression softened as he watched her happiness. "I thought you'd be pleased." He hesitated, then added, "There is one potential complication you should consider." "What's that?" she asked, still smiling as she surveyed what would be her schoolhouse. "Well," he said, suddenly seeming less sure of himself, "some folks might find it unusual if the town teacher and the town marshal were to court." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart skipping at the uncertainty in his usually confident expression. "Are you suggesting that's a possibility, Marshal Ramsey?" "I'm suggesting it's been happening for weeks, Miss Fairchild, whether we've named it or not." He took her hand gently. "I find myself thinking about you entirely too often for a man who's supposed to be focused on keeping the peace." A warm flush spread through Eleanor. "I've noticed a similar distraction in my own thoughts." "Have you now?" His smile returned, more relaxed. "And does this distraction bother you?" "Not in the slightest," she admitted. though I didn't come west looking for entanglements. Neither did I, Brock said, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. Been married to this badge for years, didn't think there was room for anything else. His blue eyes held her steadily. Until you hid behind Russell's store eavesdropping on things that weren't your business. Eleanor laughed softly. You make me sound like a troublemaker. Maybe that's exactly what I needed. He grew serious again. Eleanor, I'm not a man for half measures. If we court properly, I want you to know I'm considering a permanent arrangement. Eventually, he added quickly, seeing her widened eyes, when we're both ready. The directness of his statement took her breath away. Back in Chicago, courtships were elaborate dances of suggestion and implication, with true intentions often obscured until formal proposals. Brock's honesty was refreshingly direct, if somewhat overwhelming. I appreciate your candor, she said carefully. And I would welcome the opportunity to explore where this might lead, but I'd like to establish myself as the teacher first, to know I can stand on my own here. He nodded, seeming pleased rather than disappointed by her response. I admire that about you, Eleanor. You don't need a man to make your place in the world, though I might want one, she added softly, for entirely different reasons. The look he gave her then held such warmth and promise that Eleanor felt it like a physical touch. They stood together a moment longer, hands joined, before Brock reluctantly stepped back. I should get you back to town before Mrs. Russell sends a search party, he said. And I have deputies to swear in. As they walked back, closer now than propriety might strictly allow, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but perhaps it was the one she'd been searching for all along. The schoolhouse was completed in late October, just as the first frost silvered the grass each morning. Eleanor threw herself into preparations, ordering books and supplies, visiting families to introduce herself as the new teacher, and making the small cabin behind the school into a home. The work was exhausting but deeply satisfying. Brock respected her wish to establish herself professionally before their courtship became too public, though he found reasons to visit the schoolhouse often during construction. They developed a routine of Sunday afternoon walks after church, when they could talk freely away from the town's watchful eyes. On one such walk, a month before the school was set to open, Brock seemed unusually quiet. Eleanor had learned that his silences usually meant he was working through something important. What's troubling you? She finally asked as they followed their usual path along the creek. He glanced at her, a small smile acknowledging her perception. Got a telegram from the territorial marshal yesterday. They're establishing a federal court in Helena, need experienced lawmen to serve as marshals. Eleanor's heart sank. They've offered you a position. They have. He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. It would mean more money, more authority. Important work, bringing law to places that barely have it. You'd be leaving Willow Creek, she said, trying to keep the dismay from her voice. Their courtship had barely begun, and already it might be ending. Brock took her hands in his. I'd be leaving, he confirmed, unless I had a compelling reason to stay. The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. Brock, are you asking? I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife, he said simply. Not right away if you're not ready. But knowing that possibility exists might be enough reason for me to turn down Helena. Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. Part of her thrilled at his words in the months she'd known him. She'd grown to admire his integrity, his quiet strength, his surprising tenderness. The connection between them felt deeper than anything she'd experienced before, but another part hesitated. I don't want to be the reason you give up an opportunity you've earned. I don't want you to resent me someday. Eleanor, he said gently, I've spent 10 years bringing law to wild places. I'm proud of that work, but lately I've been thinking about building something instead of just maintaining order. A home, a family. His eyes held her steadily. A life with someone who challenges me and makes me laugh and sees more in me than just the badge. You've thought about this, she said softly. Every day since I found you hiding behind that store, he smiled. I'm not asking for an answer now, just asking you to think about it. Eleanor looked up at this man who had, against all her expectations, become so important to her in such a short time. The thought of him leaving made her heart constrict painfully. I don't need to think about it, she said quietly. My answer is yes. His eyes widened slightly. Yes to. Yes to becoming your wife. The words felt momentous, but right as they left her lips. Not immediately. I'd like to open the school first, establish myself as the teacher. But yes, Brock Ramsey, I will marry you. The joy that transformed his face was something Eleanor knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Without warning, he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that startled a laugh from her. Brock, someone might see us. He set her down gently, but kept his arms around her. Let them see. I want the whole territory to know how fortunate I am. For a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might kiss her there first, but he reluctantly stepped back, ever mindful of propriety despite his exuberance. We should discuss when. And I should speak with Reverend Gardner about posting the bans. The reality of what she'd agreed to settled over Eleanor, bringing not anxiety but a surprising calm. After the school year begins, she suggested, perhaps at Christmas break. That would give me time to prove myself as a teacher first. Christmas it is, he agreed readily. Though that's nearly 3 months away, she smiled at his impatience. 3 months is hardly an eternity. Feels like it might be, he grumbled, but his eyes were bright with happiness. As they walked back toward town, plans and possibilities unfolding between them, Eleanor marveled at how dramatically her life had changed since that day she'd hidden behind the store. She had come west seeking independence, a chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. Instead, she'd found a partner, a man who valued her strength rather than seeing it as a threat to his own. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek. Most reactions were positive. They made a handsome couple, people said, and it was about time the marshal settled down. A few raised eyebrows at the schoolteacher marrying so quickly after arriving, but Mrs. Russell defended Eleanor fiercely, insisting the match was clearly made in heaven. The school opened in November with 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Eleanor found teaching challenging but rewarding. The children were eager to learn, even the older boys who initially tested her authority. When Clive Jenkins, a strapping 15-year-old, tried to disrupt her lesson on state capitals, Eleanor calmly asked him to demonstrate his superior knowledge by naming all 38 states and their capitals. His red-faced stumbling quickly established her classroom credibility. Brock declined the position in Helena without regret. Instead, he focused on preparing their future home, purchasing a plot of land not far from the school and hiring carpenters to begin construction of a modest but sturdy house. Eleanor visited the site on weekends, offering suggestions about the layout and watching with growing excitement as their home took shape. As Christmas approached, the house was nearly complete, lacking only interior finishes that would have to wait for warmer weather. The school term ended successfully, with even the most skeptical parents impressed by their children's progress. And on a crisp, clear morning 2 days before Christmas, Eleanor Fairchild stood before the small church of Willow Creek, wearing her best dress and carrying a bouquet of winter greenery, ready to become Mrs. Brock Ramsey. Reverend Gardner smiled benevolently as he addressed the packed church. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Eleanor barely heard the familiar words, too focused on the tall man beside her. Brock looked magnificent in his dark suit, his badge polished for the occasion, but, at her request, not worn. Today, he wasn't the marshal marrying the schoolteacher. They were simply Brock and Eleanor joining their lives before their community. When the moment came to exchange vows, Eleanor's voice was steady, her heart sure. The ring Brock placed on her finger was a simple gold band, but the look in his eyes as he did so was worth more than all the jewels in Chicago. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Gardner declared. "You may kiss your bride." Brock's kiss was gentle but firm, a promise of deeper intimacies to come but appropriate for the church setting. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, the applause was enthusiastic. The celebration continued at the hotel, where Mrs. Holloway had outdone herself preparing a feast for the town. There was music and dancing, toasts and laughter, and through it all, Eleanor felt a deep contentment she had never expected to find when she'd boarded that stagecoach months ago. As evening fell, they slipped away to their new home. The interior was sparsely furnished for now: a bed, a table and chairs, a stove, and little else, but Eleanor didn't care. This was theirs, the beginning of the life they would build together. Brock built a fire in the hearth while Eleanor lit the lamps, casting the simple room in a warm glow. When he turned to her, the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "Mrs. Ramsey," he said softly, testing the new name. "Yes, Marshal Ramsey," she replied, a smile playing at her lips. He crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "I've been waiting to be alone with you all day." The intensity in his gaze sent a tremor through her. For all their conversations, all their plans, they had maintained proper boundaries during their courtship. Now, as husband and wife, those boundaries no longer existed. "I've been waiting too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached up to gently remove the pins from her hair, letting the auburn waves fall over her shoulders. "You are so beautiful," he murmured. "From the first moment I saw you hiding behind that store, I thought so." "I wasn't hiding," she protested automatically, then smiled at their private joke. "Well, perhaps I was. Thank God for eavesdroppers," he said, drawing her closer, "or I might never have met the woman who would change my life." Their second kiss was nothing like the chaste one they'd shared in church. This was a kiss of passion and promise, of 2 people who had found in each other not just love but understanding, respect, and partnership. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Eleanor rested her head on Brock's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been if I hadn't hidden behind that store that day?" His arm tightened around her. "I'd have found you eventually," he said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be. The marshal and the schoolteacher," she mused. "It sounds like the beginning of a dime novel." "Our story's better than any dime novel," Brock assured her, "and we're just getting to the good part." In the years that followed, Eleanor often thought back to that moment behind Russell's general store, when a chance encounter changed the course of her life. She had come west seeking independence, and found instead an interdependence far more satisfying than she could have imagined. Willow Creek grew along with the Ramsey family. The railroad arrived the following spring, bringing new settlers and opportunities. The school expanded to require a second teacher, though Eleanor continued teaching even after the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Sarah. Brock remained marshal but also joined the town council, helping guide Willow Creek's development with the same steady hand he brought to keeping the peace. Their house grew too, adding rooms as their family expanded to include 2 more children, a son, William, and another daughter, Margaret. Through challenges and joys, sorrows and celebrations, the foundation of their marriage remained strong, built on mutual respect, and a love that had sparked in the most unexpected of circumstances. Sometimes, visiting Russell's general store with her children in tow, Eleanor would pause near the spot where she'd hidden that fateful day. She would remember the frightened young woman she'd been, eavesdropping on a confrontation she didn't understand, and marvel at how far she'd come. "What are you smiling about, Mrs. Ramsey?" Brock would ask, finding her there. And Eleanor would simply take his hand and say, "I'm just glad you told me to come out proud."